On September 3, 1948, 6 days after polls closed in Texas's Democratic primary runoff, election officials in the dusty South Texas town of Alice made a startling announcement. They had discovered uncounted votes in Precinct 13, a ballot box that had reported 765 votes for Lyndon Johnson on election night now showed 965. 200 additional votes, all for Johnson, added 6 days after the election. Election Judge Luis Salas examined the tally sheet. What he saw shocked him, even though he had been expecting it. The number 7 in 765 had been changed to a 9. Someone had simply extended the lip of the 7 downward with a pen. Now it read 965. Salas looked at the names of the new voters, 202 names, all written in the same handwriting, all signed in the same ink, all cast in alphabetical order, and according to later investigations, most of them hadn't voted at all. Some were dead, some were out of town, some claimed they never went to the polls that day. But their votes counted. 201 votes for Lyndon Johnson, 1 vote for his opponent, Coke Stevenson. Those 201 votes gave Johnson the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate by exactly 87 votes out of 988,295 cast. The margin was so razor-thin that Johnson earned a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: Landslide Lyndon. If you want to understand how Lyndon Johnson stole his first election and how that theft launched him toward the presidency, hit that like button. This is the story of Box 13, the ballot box that changed history, the fraud that made a president. Let's go back to August 28, 1948, election night in Texas. 2 Democrats were competing for the party's nomination for U.S. Senate, Coke Robert Stevenson and Lyndon Baines Johnson. In Texas in 1948, winning the Democratic primary meant winning the general election. Republicans didn't win in Texas, so this primary was everything. Coke Stevenson was a legend, former governor of Texas, served from 1941 to 1947, popular, honest, known for fiscal restraint and administrative efficiency. Respected across the state, a man who embodied old-fashioned Texas values, integrity, hard work, conservative government. Stevenson was from West Texas, rural, ranch country. He disdained overt campaigning. He believed his record spoke for itself. He ran a quiet, dignified campaign based on his reputation, and he was winning. Lyndon Johnson, by contrast, was a political animal. Congressman since 1937, 11 years in the House. Johnson represented Texas's 10th district, Austin and the surrounding hill country. He was 39 years old, ambitious, ruthless, willing to do whatever it took to win, and Johnson knew he was losing. On election night, August 28th, Coke Stevenson won by about 2,000 votes, but Texas law required a recount if the margin was narrow, so both campaigns waited. And as additional precincts reported over the next few days, Stevenson's lead shrank. By Friday, September 3rd, Stevenson was ahead by only 150 votes. Then, that afternoon, came the bombshell. Officials in Jim Wells County announced they had found uncounted votes from Precinct 13 in the town of Alice. The ballot box, Box 13, contained 202 additional votes. Of those, 201 were for Johnson, 1 was for Stevenson. Suddenly, Lyndon Johnson was ahead by 87 votes. The Texas Democratic Executive Committee, controlled by Johnson, allies, quickly certified the results. Johnson won, barely. But he won. Except it was a lie, and everyone in Texas politics knew it. The man behind Box 13 wasn't Lyndon Johnson, it was George Parr. Known as the Duke of Duval County, Parr was the most powerful political boss in South Texas. He controlled multiple counties through a combination of patronage, intimidation, and outright fraud. George Burham Parr was born in 1901 in Benavides, Texas. His father, Archer Parr, had been a political boss before him. George inherited the machine. By the 1940s, Parr controlled politics in Duval County, Jim Wells County, and surrounding areas. He decided who won elections. He decided who got government contracts. He decided everything. Parr's power came from the Mexican-American population in South Texas. Many were poor. Many depended on Parr for jobs, for welfare, for protection. In return, they voted how Parr told them to vote, or rather, Parr voted for them, often without their knowledge. Election fraud in South Texas wasn't an exception, it was the norm. Ballot boxes were stuffed, dead people voted, names were forged. Precincts reported more votes than they had registered voters, and George Parr orchestrated it all. Lyndon Johnson knew this. He'd worked with Parr before. In 1941, Johnson ran for the Senate for the first time. He lost by 1,311 votes to Governor W. Lee Pappy O'Daniel. Johnson believed O'Daniel stole the election through fraud in East Texas. Johnson vowed never to be outstolen again. So in 1948, when Johnson ran against Coke Stevenson, he made a deal with George Parr. Parr would deliver South Texas. In return, Johnson would protect Parr's interests in Washington. It was a simple transaction, power for power. John Connally, Johnson's campaign manager and future governor of Texas, traveled to Alice during the recount period. He met with George Parr. They discussed how many votes Johnson needed to win. Parr told Connally not to worry, he'd take care of it, and he did. On September 3rd, 6 days after the election, Parr's operatives altered the tally sheet from Precinct 13. They changed 765 to 965. They added 202 names to the voter rolls, and they reported the corrected results to the state. Luis Salas was the election judge for Precinct 13. In 1977, nearly 30 years later, Salas confessed to Associated Press reporter James Mangan. The audio recordings of that confession were donated to the LBJ Presidential Library in 2023 and are now publicly available. In the tapes, Salas says it clearly. Johnson did not win that election. It was stolen for him, and I know exactly how it was done. Salas described watching as Parr ordered him to add approximately 200 votes to Johnson's total. Salas said the fraudulent votes were added in alphabetical order using names of people who hadn't voted in the election. Salas certified the results, and Johnson became the nominee. But Coke Stevenson didn't accept it. He knew it was fraud, and he was going to prove it. On September 10, 1948, Coke Stevenson traveled to Alice, Texas to investigate. He brought with him one of the most famous lawmen in American history, Frank Hamer, the Texas Ranger who led the ambush that killed Bonnie and Clyde in 1934. Stevenson and Hamer went to the Texas State Bank in Alice. They asked to see the tally sheet from Precinct 13. Bank official Tom Donald allowed them to examine it, and what they found was damning. The last 202 names were written in the same handwriting, in the same ink, in alphabetical order, a clear sign of fraud. Stevenson's team began interviewing voters whose names appeared on the list. Many claimed they hadn't voted. Some said they'd been out of town. Some were dead. The evidence was overwhelming. But when Stevenson tried to copy down the names, Tom Donald snatched the tally sheet away. "You've seen enough," he said, and that was the end of the investigation. The tally sheet disappeared. It has never been found. Box 13 itself, the actual ballot box, also disappeared. To this day, no one knows where it is. Many believe it was destroyed. Others think it's hidden somewhere in Alice, kept by someone loyal to the Parr machine. Stevenson didn't give up. He filed a lawsuit in federal court demanding an injunction to remove Johnson's name from the general election ballot. On September 24, 1948, federal Judge T. Whitfield Davidson ruled in Stevenson's favor. Judge Davidson ordered Johnson's name removed from the ballot pending a full investigation. Lyndon Johnson's political career was over. Or so it seemed. But Johnson had connections. Powerful connections. He called Washington attorney Abe Fortas, a former appointee of President Franklin D. Roosevelt and one of the most brilliant legal minds in America. Fortas saw an opening. He argued that federal courts had no jurisdiction over state elections. The dispute was an internal matter of the Texas Democratic Party. Only the state party could resolve it. Fortas appealed to Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black. Black was one of the most influential justices in Supreme Court history. He'd been appointed by FDR in 1937, and he had a complicated past. He'd been a member of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s before distancing himself from the organization. On September 28, 1948, Justice Hugo Black intervened. He overturned Judge Davidson's ruling. Black held that the federal courts could not interfere with state elections. The Texas Democratic Executive Committee, not the federal. Judiciary had the authority to certify the primary results. The TDEC, controlled by Johnson loyalists, upheld the original result. Johnson's 87-vote victory stood. His name remained on the ballot. And on November 2, 1948, Johnson won the general election easily. Democrats always won in Texas. Lyndon Johnson was going to the U.S. Senate, and the fraud that got him there would remain officially unresolved. But the truth wouldn't stay buried forever. In 1952, 4 years after the election, something strange happened. Sam Smithwick, a former deputy sheriff in Jim Wells County, was in prison serving a sentence for murder. He'd killed a radio station manager named Bill Mason in 1949. Smithwick claimed Mason knew too much about the Box 13 fraud and was going to expose it. From prison, Smithwick wrote to Coke Stevenson. He said he had information about the stolen election. He invited Stevenson to visit him in Huntsville Penitentiary. He said he was ready to talk. But before Stevenson could visit, Smithwick was found dead, hanging in his cell. Officially ruled a suicide, Smithwick's family didn't believe it. They insisted he'd been murdered to prevent him from revealing what he knew, but no investigation followed. The case was closed. In 1977, election judge Luis Salas finally broke his silence. He told AP reporter James Mangan the full story, how George Parr ordered the votes added, how Salas watched them being written in alphabetical order, how the names came from people who hadn't voted. Salas's confession made headlines across the country. Ex-official says he stole 1948 election for Johnson, the New York Times reported on July 30, 1977. But by then, everyone involved was dead. George Parr had shot himself in 1975, shortly after being convicted of tax evasion. Lyndon Johnson died in 1973. Coke Stevenson died in 1975. John Connally was still alive but refused to comment. No one would ever be prosecuted. The statute of limitations had long expired, and the evidence, Box 13, the tally sheet, the voter rolls, had all disappeared. But the confession was on tape. Salas described exactly how it was done, and in 2023, those tapes were donated to the LBJ Presidential Library. They're now available online. Anyone can listen. Robert Caro, Lyndon Johnson's biographer, investigated Box 13 extensively for his book, Means of Ascent, published in 1990. Caro concluded unequivocally, Johnson stole the election. Caro interviewed witnesses, examined court records, analyzed the numbers. His conclusion, the fraud in Jim Wells County was blatant, systematic, and decisive. Without Box 13, Coke Stevenson would have won. And if Stevenson had won, Johnson's political career would have ended in 1948. He would never have become Senate Majority Leader, never become Vice President, never become President. John F. Kennedy would not have chosen Johnson as his running mate in 1960. Without Johnson on the ticket, Kennedy might not have carried Texas. Without Texas, Kennedy might not have won the presidency. And even if Kennedy still won, without Johnson as vice president, someone else would have been in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Someone else would have become president when Kennedy was assassinated. The entire course of American history, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Act, the Great Society, all of it depended on Box 13. On 202 fraudulent votes, on George Parr's willingness to steal an election, on Lyndon Johnson's willingness to accept the theft. Let's be clear about what happened. This wasn't minor irregularities. This wasn't a close election with disputed ballots. This was systematic, deliberate fraud. The evidence is overwhelming. 202 votes added 6 days after the election, all written in the same handwriting, all signed in the same ink, all in alphabetical order. The tally sheet altered, 7 changed to 9. Voters interviewed who claimed they didn't vote. Luis Salas's confession describing exactly how it was done. And Johnson knew. John Connally traveled to Alice during the recount. Johnson's campaign coordinated with George Parr. Johnson's attorneys fought to prevent investigation. Johnson benefited directly from the fraud. Did Johnson personally order the theft? We don't know. Johnson never admitted it. His defenders argue that both sides committed fraud, that Stevenson also had support from corrupt political machines, and that Johnson simply out-cheated him. George Reedy, who later served as Johnson's White House press secretary, claimed that if Stevenson really wanted an honest count, he would have appealed to the Texas Supreme Court, which could have impounded all ballots. Instead, Stevenson went to federal court. Reedy implied this meant Stevenson had his own fraud to hide, but that argument doesn't hold up. Stevenson went to federal court because the Texas Democratic Party machinery was controlled by Johnson allies. The state party had already certified Johnson's victory. Stevenson needed federal intervention because the state system was rigged. The truth is simple. Lyndon Johnson's first major political victory was built on fraud. Box 13 launched his career. Without it, he would have remained a congressman. Without it, he never would have become president. In 1967, journalist Ronnie Duggar visited President Johnson in the White House. Duggar asked about Box 13. Johnson's response was revealing. He didn't deny the fraud. He justified it. Johnson essentially argued that everyone did it, that South Texas politics had always been corrupt, that he was just playing the game according to the rules that existed, and that focusing on Box 13 ignored the bigger picture of what he'd accomplished as president. But that's not an excuse. That's an admission. Johnson's presidency was consequential. He passed landmark civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Ironically, a man who stole an election through voter fraud later signed laws to protect voting rights. He created Medicare and Medicaid. He launched the War on Poverty. He expanded federal aid to education. His domestic achievements were enormous. But he also escalated the Vietnam War. He lied to Congress about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. He presided over a war that killed 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese. He left office deeply unpopular, his legacy tarnished, and it all started with Box 13. With a stolen election in Amenpanas, a small Texas town, with 202 fraudulent votes written in alphabetical order. The physical evidence is gone. Box 13 disappeared. The tally sheet disappeared. Most witnesses are dead. But the confession remains. Luis Salas on tape in 1977 describing exactly how the election was stolen. Johnson did not win that election. It was stolen for him, and I know exactly how it was done. Those words are recorded. They're in the archives. They're undeniable. The question isn't whether the election was stolen. The question is, how much did Lyndon Johnson know? And how involved was he personally? We may never have definitive proof, but the pattern is clear. Johnson's campaign coordinated with George Parr. John Connally traveled to Alice. The fraud happened in counties controlled by political bosses who supported Johnson. Johnson's attorneys fought to prevent investigation, and Johnson benefited. If Johnson didn't order it directly, he certainly accepted it. He didn't withdraw when the fraud was exposed. He didn't demand an honest recount. He fought to keep the fraudulent results. And he won. Box 13 taught Lyndon Johnson a lesson he would never forget. If you're willing to do whatever it takes, if you're willing to lie, cheat, and steal, you can win. Power goes to those who want it most. Ethics are for losers. That lesson would define Johnson's career. From the Senate to the Vice Presidency to the Presidency, Johnson operated by one rule: win at any cost. And on November 22, 1963, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, Lyndon Johnson's home state, many people wondered, did Johnson's willingness to do whatever it takes extend that far? We don't know. But we know this: the man who became president on November 22, 1963, was the same man who stole an election in 1948, the same man who accepted 202 fraudulent votes, the same man who fought to prevent investigation, the same man who would do anything for power. Box the 13, 202 votes, 87 vote margin, Landslide Lyndon, the fraud that made a president, the theft that changed history. If this story made you question what you thought you knew about Lyndon Johnson's rise to power, do something powerful. Hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube this buried history deserves to be heard. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our investigations into the frauds, thefts, and cover-ups that shaped American politics. Every day, we uncover evidence hidden in declassified documents, forgotten testimonies, and audio recordings powerful people wished were destroyed. Stories of stolen elections, political machines, and the men who would do anything for power, true crime, true politics, true history. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment. Did Lyndon Johnson steal the 1948 election? Or was this just normal politics in 1940s Texas? Are you in the U.S., Europe, Middle East, Asia? Our community spans the globe. Share your thoughts. Share your city. Keep this conversation alive, because some elections are close, some are disputed, but some, like Texas in 1948, are stolen. Thank you for watching, and remember, history doesn't repeat, but it echoes. Box 13 disappeared, but the truth remains. The tally sheet vanished, but the confession exists. The evidence was destroyed, but the fraud is undeniable. Lyndon Johnson stole his first election. 202 votes, 87 vote margin, and it launched him to the presidency. The question isn't whether it happened. The question is, what else was he willing to do? Box 13, the ballot. Box that changed history, the fraud that made a president.